Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another episode of Time Warp for you. This is a series where I talk about things that were removed from the game for one reason or another, and in this episode, I'll be talking about something more on the abstract side, and that was the leveling process in vanilla World of Warcraft. When people ask about vanilla, one of their common questions is always, what was the leveling like? If I had to summarize it in one sentence, I'd say leveling in World of Warcraft during vanilla was a major part of the game. And what I mean by that is, nowadays, leveling is seen as a minor chore that you just steamroll through to get to the real meat of an MMO, and that's the endgame experience with dungeons, PvP, and raiding. Back in vanilla, the leveling process was a major experience that defined the game as an MMO, and it's one of the bigger points brought up in the whole vanilla versus current game argument that you see all the time. So, in this video, I want to try and explain fully the leveling experience in vanilla. How long it took, how difficult it was, and how different it was compared to the current game. Note that I'll of course be comparing vanilla to the current game a lot in this video. Don't take that as a vanilla versus current game argument though. I just need a basis for comparison. It might sound like I'm putting the current game down, but what I think it lacks in some areas, it makes up for in others, so please don't take this as a quote current game sucks video, because it's not the goal. Personally, I like the game in both its current state and how it was in vanilla in many different aspects. So, the main thing people will tell you is that it took longer, which is very true. The max level back then was 60, and it could take months for some people. It really depended on your class and dedication, but it wasn't unheard of to rack up several weeks of playtime before you finally hit the max level. There were several reasons for this. First is the most intuitive. Just the amount of experience you got from enemies in quests was quite low. Just as a random example, say today you need 10 quests for 40 to 41, back then the equivalent would have been at least 25 I'd say with your lower rewards. And you had to do that for 60 levels. As you would imagine, the early levels up to 15ish were on the quicker side, and from there was when it started to slow down. The second reason was because the mobs were more difficult. Nowadays, you have no issue pulling huge packs of enemies, but back then, depending on your class, even pulling just 2 non-elite enemies was a death sentence. Typically, these were classes like the warrior who couldn't really heal themselves while in combat. Pet classes like the warlock and hunter definitely had it easier. And after every fight or two, you had to stop for a half a minute and eat some food to regain health, or drink to regain mana. Most classes didn't have abilities that healed themselves up quickly. Regeneration was much slower, and you had to make sure that you had a big stockpile of food and water before heading out on a leveling session. Another thing that made them harder was the fact that there was no mob sharing. Only the first person who tagged the enemy got credit, which means you generally had to go solo unless you grouped up with someone. Another big reason was the quests were also much harder to follow because you didn't have quest markers. The only way to figure out where to go was to actually read the quest. I know, crazy huh? Usually, they would say go kill those guys to the northeast or to the south. They didn't say how far, and unlike the current game, you had no idea if the mobs you were looking at were part of your quest or not. Of course, you could tell if it was a Kill X quest, but for the quests that required you to loot items from a corpse, you had no idea until you've killed several enemies. And in that regard, those types of quests were much more unforgiving in terms of drop rates. I believe one of the worst ones was the Raptor Heart quests in the Arathi Highlands. Why wasn't it a 100% drop rate? There were a lot of raptors running around without hearts. How did they do that? This video game with magic and dragons sure isn't realistic. Anyways, the quests varied in ambiguity. Some were pretty straightforward and the first camp you ran across with your limited directions was the right spot, and others were simply, go find this NPC. Mancrick's wife in the Barrens is a particularly popular example of this. But you weren't totally in the dark. Just like with Wowhead now, you did have another website called Thoughtbot that was a handy database of all of the quests. You'd search the quests on this site and look in the comments for helpful advice from other players who figured it out already. Another point for difficulty was that there were a lot of elite quests. In each zone, you had a handful of quests that required you to kill an elite enemy or even go through an elite compound. For the most part, these were soloable and you had to find other players to group with before you could knock them out. If you were a hunter or warlock, you had a chance, but anything other than that, you had no chance unless you just out-leveled it, of course. Another big reason why it was so difficult was that there just weren't enough quests a lot of the times. Today, you can breeze to the max level even skipping more than half the zones, but in vanilla, you pretty much had to go through every single zone and do every quest, and even still, it wasn't enough sometimes, and you had to straight up grind mobs or dungeons. In the alpha, the game initially had just 100 quests total throughout both continents combined, and the devs thought even that was too much. Luckily, they came to their senses with that one. I mentioned dungeons earlier, so let's talk about those. I'd say in general these were also harder. The mobs hit harder, and you pretty much had to bring some crowd control unless you just outleveled them. And not even that, even getting to them was harder. Nowadays, it's as simple as queuing up in the group finder, but back then to form a party, you usually barked in the city for a while until you got 5 people. And you of course didn't get instantly teleported right in. You and your party had to walk all the way to the dungeon. As a result, warlocks were in high demand. There were no icons on the map to tell you of the dungeon's location, so you had to figure that out yourself. Hopefully at least one group member knew where it was. And not only that, but typically the entrance was guarded by a plethora of elite enemies, so even zoning in was a challenge a lot of the times. But a bright side to all of this was that it forced interaction, and this is something I'll be talking about a lot in this video. Joining groups, traveling to the dungeon, fighting your way through it, doing those elite quests I mentioned earlier, mobs not sharing, all of this was much more time consuming and difficult to do, and as a result, you interacted with people more. You started chatting with people, added them to your friends list to do more dungeons with each other in the future, maybe even join their guild and meet all of their friends. Interaction, the core of MMOs. With these tools of convenience such as mob sharing, face roll leveling, and the group finder, there's no real reason to communicate with other players at all. And if someone does talk to you, they usually don't even say your name. You're instead demoted to your class or role, like Pole Tank or Resme Priest. I'm not saying that these tools of convenience are necessarily a bad thing for the game. Evolution is inevitable. All I'm saying is that everything comes at a cost, and it's an important point to bring up when trying to explain just how different vanilla leveling and dungeon running was compared to the current game. Because all of this stuff was more involved, you connected with people more, made more friends, and it's a very important side effect. A good example for me personally is that nearly 13 years ago, I ran the Sunken Temple dungeon with 4 other people. That dungeon was such a maze, even having some puzzles tied to it. It took hours to finish and figure out, but we did it, and I became friends with them. I ended up joining their guild, did more runs of different dungeons, started raiding, and I'm happy to say that we're still friends to this day over a decade later. It's something I treasure quite a lot, and if it was simply a process of queuing up and blowing through the now simplified Sunken Temple as fast as possible, would I have become friends with them? Probably not. So I think that's the bread and butter of the leveling process covered pretty thoroughly at this point. Mob difficulty, questing, and dungeons. Now, let's talk about the more subtle details, starting with the actual traveling. Something that made leveling more time consuming was the traveling. Getting around in Azeroth was an adventure itself a lot of the times. Back then, you got your 60% speed mount at level 40 as opposed to level 20, and your 100 speed mount at 60 as opposed to 40. Remember when running through water would dismount you? That would drive me nuts. And of course the most major point, no flying. This not only made things slower, but it also made things more dangerous. You couldn't fly over entire areas, and on PvP servers there was no escape. This made hotspots such as the Stranglethorn Vale the most dangerous leveling zone in the game. Many people hold fond memories sneaking through the jungle waiting to get ganked at any moment. On PvP servers, World PvP was a very big part of the leveling process because it was exacerbated by the slow leveling rate. Players would spend much more time in zones like Stranglethorn Vale, and it would be teeming with members of both factions. It was a bloodbath to say the least. Anyways, back to traveling. There were far fewer flight points, so even griffins weren't helpful a lot of the times, and even still, up until a certain patch, flight paths weren't connected. So, if you wanted to fly a considerable distance, you had to fly to one town, land, pick the next town, wait, land, pick the next hub, and so on. The griffins in general were much slower too. I believe the longest flight path was around 30 minutes long from northern to southern Kalimdor. Hearthstones were less useful too, since they had a 60-minute cooldown as opposed to the 15 now. There weren't any portals really like with what you have in Dalaran, and if you wanted to get to the other continent, you had to ride a boat or a zeppelin, and those were also pretty slow. As a result, if you were a mage in vanilla and you were in a major city, you were going to get whispers from a lot of players asking you for ports. The more industrious mages actually made quite a lot selling portals to other cities. But just the difficulty and the amount of time it took weren't the only things that were different with vanilla leveling. Now this wasn't tied solely to vanilla of course, but this was when you still had the old talent system and the old talent trees. These looked very different to how they look now. To sum it up, there were many more talents, but they were less impactful, and you didn't pick a specialization. You could use your points to improve any spec that you wanted to. For every level you got, you would get 1 talent point to spend as you pleased. This is important because it was something that made the grind more bearable. For every level, as you inched closer towards the next, you had this reward to make your character just a bit stronger. You'd look at your tree while you're en route to your next quest or while you were on the griffin, mulling over your choices. Most were small percentage increases, but you did have some major ones in there as well. Even abilities, but those were typically pretty far into the trees. A nice bit of character progression that served as the carrot on a stick, if you will. And similarly, you also had skill training. As you know, today, you learn skills automatically and they scale with you upon leveling, but back then, every even level, you had to return to one of your major cities and have your class trainer teach you your new skills. This was also back when you had skill ranks and you would gradually upgrade your current skills. So this was another big aspect in the leveling. Something else to look forward to and think about because a lot of the times you didn't have enough gold to train everything. You had to pick and choose the best skill upgrades to get you to the next level. That's another aspect that made leveling harder. Everyone was broke in vanilla, which just compounded things further. Sometimes you couldn't really afford that griffin ride, so you walked instead. You couldn't afford big bags, so you were constantly running back to town to sell junk. And sometimes you couldn't even afford food, which slowed things down. It was really handy to have a mage friend who could make you food back then. And sometimes you couldn't even afford your repair bill. How the heck did you get gold if you didn't have gear? So gold is another important thing to bring up when you're talking about vanilla leveling, and you had to make sure that you weren't broke or it would make things so much harder and more time consuming. So I think you get the picture by now. There'll always be something I missed, but I think I covered the more major aspects of vanilla leveling. The slower traveling, the harder dungeons, the harder quests, the lack of quests, the less XP, the empty pockets. In the face of all of this, you pushed and pushed. You grinded your skull against a brick wall, and maybe even months later, you finally hit level 60. It was quite the adventure, visiting dozens and dozens of zones on both continents, several dungeons, meeting new friends, and steadily improving your character. It was a long but rewarding experience for level 2, 60, and every level in between, and upon reaching the max, you had a whole new adventure waiting for you with the endgame. My main goal for this video was to answer that common question I talked about earlier, and that was, what was vanilla leveling like? And hopefully, you got an adequate answer. The most common answer was that it was harder or more time consuming, but that's not the whole story. It wasn't just the difficulty that was changed. Certain aspects have been picked away to simplify things, RPG elements have been traded away for the sake of convenience, and over time, leveling became more and more minor to the point to where it's just a side attraction. Today, it's a bump in the road, but back then, it was the road itself. Is this the way it should be? I honestly don't know. That's something you should decide on your own. That's about it for this one though. I hope you found the video interesting or entertaining because it was a really fun one to make. It really got me thinking about what MMOs are at their core. Are they more about that endgame rating and challenge, or level grinding? Is it the social aspect that makes them special? Who's to say it's just one? Maybe it's a mix of everything. What do you think? How would you feel if, in the next expansion, they put leveling back in the spotlight? Instead of reaching 120 in 2 days, maybe it should take a month. Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Anyways, I'll leave you here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next episode of Time Warp. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.